Good evening and welcome. My name is Ina Cord, and I am chair of the Human Trafficking Awareness Committee of National Council of Jewish Women of Canada, Toronto. On behalf of our organization, I welcome you here this evening. We have been providing awareness and education of the heinous activity of human sex trafficking since 2013. This is our second awareness presentation of 2022, and we are committed to providing parents, grandparents, caregivers, and any interested members of the community information on how to protect our children against the presence of human sex trafficking in our midst. For several years prior to Mother's Day, we have been promoting meaningful relationships between mothers and daughters, between parents, grandparents, caregivers, and children as a means of prevention and/or offering suggestions to receive the necessary help if victimization is suspected. We have two social workers with us tonight, Andrea Burke and Julia Cusato, who have much experience working with both parents and children, and they will impart very important and necessary information on how to have the conversation of this very difficult issue. So just a couple of announcements before we begin. The presentation will be an hour in duration, including time for Q&A. We ask that you write your questions in the chat, and Myra will direct them to the speakers. We offer an anonymous comments contact in our chat if you do not wish your name to be attached to your question. At 8:30, we will officially end, but if there is an interest after the hour for more questions, our speakers have agreed to stay on. And so before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that our president, Sheila Neuberger, is here tonight. Sheila, would you wave and thanks for being here, Sheila. Thank you. So I now call on Debbie Wasserman, our national president and a member of our committee. Debbie?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Debbie Wasserman, and I am president of National Council of Jewish Women of Canada. It was established in 1897 and is a nonprofit volunteer service organization dedicated to identifying community needs and bringing about meaningful changes in our communities. We're committed to enhancing the lives of individuals through education, service, and social action. It's my pleasure to be here tonight to welcome you on behalf of NCJWC. Before beginning our program, I acknowledge that the lands on which we are hosting this meeting tonight include the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. These people have experienced many injustices in what we now call Canada. These injustices continue to affect their well-being. I ask that we stay mindful and reflect on this from the territories where we sit or stand today. And I now call upon a member of our Human Trafficking Committee, Elke Handelman, to introduce our speakers.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenters this evening. Julia Cusato is the Human Trafficking Prevention Facilitator at Victim Services of Durham Region. Julia is a University of Toronto graduate with a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. Recently, Julia completed her postgraduate certificate in addictions and mental health from Humber College, which provided her with the knowledge and skills to support vulnerable individuals using a trauma-informed and client-focused approach. Julia works with victims or survivors of complex trauma in a variety of capacities and is passionate about human trafficking prevention and early intervention. It's now my pleasure to introduce Andrea Burke, who is a registered social worker. She holds her Master's of Social Work from Wurzweiler School of Social Work with a certificate in child welfare. Andrea currently works with both the Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect, called SCAN program, and Lotus Health at the Hospital for Sick Children. Andrea works with children, youth, and families who have experienced physical, sexual, and/or emotional abuse and neglect, as well as working with children and youth who are at risk of, involved in, or exiting commercial sex trafficking. Andrea works from a trauma-informed lens and provides crisis-based care, brief trauma work, and long-term trauma work. Andrea collaborates with community partners, provides education around commercial sex trafficking in the community, and provides consultation within the hospital and community. Please take it away, ladies.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to get our presentation up and then we can begin from there. Okay, so hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introductions. I will go quickly and introduce myself, and then I'll pass it over to Andrea, who will get us started very shortly. So again, my name is Julia, and I actually moved up from the title of Human Trafficking Prevention Facilitator since we last spoke, and I am now the Human Trafficking Outreach Counselor, and I'm doing some more work around identifying techniques for early intervention with youth. And I'm here today with Andrea. Hey, Andrea.
Hi. Hi. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And I'm Andrea, and I work at Sick Kids Hospital, and I work very closely with youth and their families in scenarios where they're either at risk of, involved in currently, or trying to exit a trafficking situation. I work on a medical team, so it is healthcare and sexual health, as well as counseling and psychosocial support.
Awesome. And that's a little bit about us. And today's topic of conversation is going to be around raising awareness, how to talk to children about human sex trafficking. So we have a lot here for you. Before we jump in, I'm going to do a bit of a disclaimer, and then I'll pass it over to Andrea to go over our agenda and learning objectives. So today's subject matter, again, will touch on domestic sex trafficking, and the material presented can definitely be heavy and can definitely be triggering. So we just want to encourage everybody to just take care of themselves today. If you need to, at any moment, feel free to shut your camera, take a deep breath, listen in. Maybe you need to walk away, log off, and come back on. We'll be happy to admit you back into the presentation. Maybe when we're done here today, if you want to reach out and chat, we're happy to do that with you as well. Or you can turn to somebody that you trust and have an awesome conversation with them as well. Put on your favorite Netflix show, your favorite song, whatever that looks like, and make sure you're taking that extra care of yourself today after the presentation. Again, if it becomes increasingly overwhelming, then please feel free to reach out for support. Awesome. So I'll pass it over to Andrea.
So today some of our agenda and what we're going to go through, and I know this looks like a lot, but we're going to do our best to kind of condense it. We are going to do a very brief overview of what is trafficking, a bit about risks and red flags for trafficking, what to do if you feel your child is at risk, how to initiate those conversations around trafficking and consent, modeling healthy relationships, and identifying vulnerabilities and empowering youth. And then we also have a set of resources that we've put together that are also helpful for families to be aware of and community members. And then we'll get to our Q&A. So we can go to next slide. So just from the Criminal Code of Canada, this is just the very clear definition of what is human trafficking, which involves the recruitment, transportation, harboring, and or exercising control, direction, or influence over the movement of a person in order to exploit that person, typically through sexual exploitation or forced labor. It's often described as a modern form of slavery. And then when we look at exploitation specifically, it's defined as causing a person to provide or offer to provide a labor or service by engaging in contact that could reasonably be expected to cause the other person to believe that their safety or the safety of a person they know would be threatened if they did not provide this labor of service. And in Canada, the law states that no one can actually consent to having any of the activities that are part of the definition of human trafficking. So just to go over, I know that's a lot of words, so I just wanted to provide this little graphic which kind of shows you exactly how human trafficking works. So it's any type of control, so whether that's recruiting, transporting, transferring, receiving, holding, concealing, harboring, all of these different kinds of control for the purpose of exploitation. So that would be causing to provide or offer to provide a labor or service in such a way that there's a threat to the person's safety. And within this power and control, there's no consent that is valid. So what I wanted to do is just to show a quick 2-minute video. So this video is it was created by Renelle Bruder, who's a survivor and an advocate who we've actually worked closely with at Lotus Health, who's been on our advisory committee and been supportive in helping to create our program and influence our program, and does a lot of advocacy work in the community and also has started her own non-for-profit. So this video actually I use this video with youth. So when starting a conversation or trying to explain what sex trafficking is, this can actually sometimes be a tool for parents as well to use when kind of trying to explain to children or to go through with for themselves as well. And I've used this anywhere from 11 years old and up. So we can go ahead and play that, Julia, whenever it's ready.
Hi there. You may have heard of something called sex trafficking. I know, it's been in the news a lot lately, and you're probably thinking it could never happen to you or any of your friends. But the truth is, sex trafficking is already happening across Canada. Young Canadian girls and boys, some the same age as you or even younger, and from all different backgrounds and ethnicities, become victims of trafficking. And most of them have no idea it was even happening until it was too late. My name is Renelle Bruder, and I'm a sex trafficking survivor and an anti-trafficking advocate. So what is sex trafficking? It's when a person, generally a vulnerable underage youth, is lured, tricked, and manipulated into selling their body for sex to make money for somebody else. So how does it happen? It typically starts with luring, where traffickers will look for vulnerable young people to connect with. And this can happen anywhere, like at school, the mall, or even online. It can be something that seems innocent, like sending a message on social media, like, "Hey, beautiful." If they get a reply, that's the first step in the luring process. They'll try to learn as much as possible about the person and their life. This may not seem like a bad thing, but traffickers will use this information to manipulate the person later on. Next is the grooming. Traffickers will use all the information they gathered to play in the person's emotions and any insecurities they have, like problems with their parents, school, anxiety, or body image issues. Then they may get love bombed, meaning within a really short period of time, the trafficker showers the victim with attention, expensive gifts, trips, even drugs and alcohol to impair their judgment. Next is the manipulation and control. At this point, the victim thinks the trafficker is their boyfriend, girlfriend, or even best friend. But here, they'll really start to push the boundaries and pressure the victim to do things they aren't comfortable with, while slowly isolating them from family and friends. That's what leads to exploitation. This might start with working in a massage parlor or stripping at a club. They'll tell the victim, "It's just this once," or think about how much money they'll make. Then it progresses into sex acts. And if the victim tries to say no or leave, the trafficker may threaten them or become violent. Sex trafficking is real, and it's happening right here to young Canadian women and men. So remember how trafficking happens, and talk to a trusted friend or adult if you feel that you or your friends may be in danger. And lastly, if something seems too good to be true, trust your instincts. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Always love that video. It kind of puts everything into perspective in a short amount of time. So really awesome. Thanks, Andrea. All right, so I'm going to jump into some red flags and warning signs. And so again, this presentation is not going to focus too much on the human trafficking component and more on the practical lens and approach that we will take to support individuals that we think may be at risk for trafficking. And red flags is definitely part of that as well. So in terms of red flags and warning signs, there's a whole number of them on this list that I'll quickly run through, and then we'll go into what exactly to do if you feel that a youth is being trafficked or at risk of being trafficked. So in terms of red flags and warning signs, it is important to keep in mind that if just the presence of maybe 1, 2, or 3 of these things is happening, it doesn't necessarily conclude that human trafficking is what is occurring, but it does invite us to ask questions about that young person's safety, if they're okay, if there's something else going on, because maybe it's not human trafficking, but maybe it's some other form of violence that could also be ensuing as well. So we definitely want to ask these questions. So if there is a young person who maybe has a new partner in their life, and this person seems to be abusive, whether that's emotionally abusive, physically abusive, or psychologically abusive. If the young person is coming home with unexplained money, and this is a little bit more than a typical side job kind of money that they would be getting, like wads of cash is what we're looking for. And if they can't explain where they're getting it from. So even if they do work a part-time job or a full-time job and their amount of money that they're holding on to doesn't equate to that, and you as a parent or caregiver or adult having given them that money and they can't really explain where it's coming from, then that's a huge red flag and warning sign. If this person has new brand name clothing or any sort of luxury items, that's another big red flag, especially again, if they can't explain where they're getting those things from. If nails, hair, lashes are consistently done, and that's not atypical, especially for a young person of today to have their nails done, their lashes done. But things that we want to look for is if these are consistently changing. Nails are really, really expensive to get done, especially if they're different sets of fake nails. And so with regards to that, maybe that trafficker is funding that individual to consistently get their nails done based off of what clients like and what clients want. So maybe every Tuesdays they have on a red set of nails because they're servicing a client Tuesday nights who prefers that, and then that they would be able to make more money through that service. Hotel pens, receipts, hotel key cards. So if there is a young person, they're holding on to a whole number of these things from hotels, even if it's just one hotel key card, it could be because a trafficker is staying at a hotel room and then giving the young person the key to that hotel room that they can come in and out of when they're servicing clients. If they start to create distance or isolate from family and friends that they've been historically really close with and really interested in, if they start to create a dependency on this new person, if there is a mistrust of other people, especially family and police, and that hasn't really happened before, if they ask you as a parent, caregiver, guardian, or maybe they're asking siblings and friends to do things that are outside of their comfort level and outside of their comfort zone, if they're introducing drugs and alcohol into the relationship pretty frequently, if you see an increased exposure to sex, sexting, porn, and strip clubs in this young person's life, if they're 15 at a strip club and mentioning strip clubs, what are they doing there and why are they there? Who's taken them there? If somebody is holding onto their ID, so whether that's driver license or other pieces of ID, even health cards, and you don't know when they can get them back, and they're keeping these IDs, they're not telling you who has these IDs, why is somebody holding on to these official documents? Even if somebody has a number of different fake IDs, especially if there's multiple fake IDs, and then each fake ID, the photo of them looks a little bit different, and the name on that ID looks a little bit different. Those are more identities that they would play on or that they could be using in the sex trade. If they say that they're working as an escort for a better future, that they're choosing to do this, but then that partner becomes involved in that as well, we want to ask a lot of questions around that too, especially if they're underage. If they become abusive themselves, so again, in any form of abuse, if they drop one friend group for a completely new friend group, and this happens pretty quickly, and this new friend group doesn't seem to have the best intentions, And if they become a night owl, and things like this, again, are not uncommon for young people, but what we're specifically looking for here is if there's a young person frequently doing sleepovers, friends are frequently covering for them, they are coming to school or home and they're extremely exhausted, they look malnourished, they look disheveled, they look like they're sweaty, and different things like that is what we're looking for, because maybe perhaps overnight or on the weekend, instead of actually sleeping at friends' houses, they were with a trafficker and they were seeing different clients. So again, with regards to red flags and warning signs, every situation is different, and these are just important to keep at the front of mind to ask some questions and determine what is going on in that situation. So if some of these red flags or warning signs do come up, this is what we're going to tackle in this slide. What exactly to do, starting from before you have any conversation with the young person all the way until after. And then Andrea is going to take it forward from here and go into more depths about how to actually initiate this really hard conversation. So we'll start off with before. So if, again, we're seeing some of the red flags and warning signs, they're showing up, before we even have a conversation, we want to do a little bit of education. We want to learn a little bit about what human trafficking is, what it entails, and we want to develop a safe space to have that conversation with the youth in. And when it comes to safe space, we're thinking about a number of different factors. We want an emotionally safe space where this person feels like they are free of judgments, they can come, they can share, and nobody will judge them or shame them or blame them in this space. We want to think physically of space as well. We want to make sure that there are exits, or that there's opportunities for this young person to leave, that they're not being cornered and feel like they're forced into making some sort of disclosure that they're not ready for at that point in time. So we want to think about safety in that conversation. Then we want to make sure that if we're going to start a conversation, that our love and care for that person is at the forefront of our minds. Before anything else, before any of the fears, before any of the other really scary things that come with trafficking, we want to make sure this person knows that we care about them and we love them, and we're coming to this conversation not to judge them, not to get upset with them, but because we love them and care about them. We also want to think about setting boundaries for that conversation. Maybe you're going to sit with that young person and ask them, like, hey, I have something that I really want to talk to you about. I really care about you. I've been noticing a couple things. When is a good time for you to have this conversation? Because, for example, if they're in the middle of exam season or they have a math test coming up, might not be the best time to kind of get all of these things happening in that moment. And that's not to say that we want to prolong the conversation. We just want to make sure that this young person feels like they're in a safe headspace and that they're ready and that they know this conversation is coming up. So again, that they don't feel cornered. And we can develop a safe word for them if at any points in the conversation they feel like they need a rest, they need to break, and they need to leave that conversation. And we want to make sure that if we're going to have a conversation with them, we're going to take turns and actually listen to everything that they're saying to us. And finally, before the conversation, we also don't want to expect youth to know that they are being trafficked or what human trafficking is. Oftentimes, especially as adults, this is the first time we're hearing some of this content and all of these different things. So we want to make sure that we're not expecting the youth to know the stages of exploitation, what grooming is, and that we're not using these really clinical terms for trafficking. We're going to follow suit of the language that they use in their situation. Then finally, we're going to start to have that conversation. We're going to keep the focus on the youth during the entire conversation. We're going to use empowering language. So we're going to remind them of their strength, even though it is completely hard and might be a really difficult conversation. We're going to bring up all these really important things to remind them of their worth, that we love them, and that we care about them. We're going to be really mindful of our facial expressions and our body language. Youth are really, really sneaky. And what they tend to do a lot of the times, even to me, is they're going to drop a bomb of information that is really, really scary and might not even pertain to them, just to see how you'll react to it before they even share with you what's actually going on for them. Because they want to see if you can handle it or not. So they're going to test those waters. But otherwise, what they're going to do is really watch out for the way that your face is moving, if you're open body language, if you're closed off, and then they're going to determine whether or not they're going to share something with you. So again, being mindful of that, having a relaxed expression with the person, having neutral facial expressions. And again, this is really hard, so take breaks if needed. We want to ask direct questions to the youth about what's going on, and then continue to reflect empathy and understanding throughout that entire conversation. In terms of follow-up and aftercare, the next steps and support options will really depend on what comes up in the conversation. Again, Andrea will touch a bit on this as well as after the conversations and different supports and resources we can offer. So in the short term, make sure that both of you are checking in on your mental health as a parent or adult or caregiver, community member concerned and having the conversation. Make sure that you're doing a mental check-in with yourself and that that youth is getting a mental health check-in as well. And then reaching out for support or resources. And then in the long term, we want to continue to meet that youth's needs, continue to be aware of their vulnerabilities and any red flags or warning signs that may come up after the conversation, and continue to remind them that they are loved and cared for. Some things that we would typically want to try to avoid in these conversations is, again, expecting that youth to disclose or share right away. Sometimes, as I mentioned, they might not even know that this is happening. And when you share with them what human trafficking is, it is a big shocker to them about that. Oh my gosh, this is actually happening to me. I can't believe this is happening to me. And all that turmoil is going on for them. So we don't want to expect them to share too much too quickly. It takes time. And we want to let them know that we are willing to be there with them as they continue to process all this information. We want to stop using crime-specific language, again, language around human trafficking. If this person is calling the trafficker their boyfriend, girlfriend, or partner, we want to match that language, even though we recognize this person as a trafficker. We want to avoid bringing up past arguments and keeping the focus of the conversation on the current conversation topic at hand. We want to avoid expecting youth to cope alone. So it's not just a matter of having this conversation once, we want to continue on with it afterwards. And we want to avoid blaming or shaming the youth or thinking that the youth should know better or that they shouldn't have done this because we've taught them better. And that's definitely not the case, even though we have some really strong and really amazing parents out there. Sometimes youth get involved in things that is not their fault and they get engaged with the wrong sorts of people. And so it's not a matter of them knowing better. Sometimes it's just a matter of the situation and circumstance, and we want to reflect that understanding. So in terms of tips and tricks about initiating youth conversations, I'll hand it off to Andrea.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about, initiating that conversation about trafficking. And I think it's hard because parents do have to do a little bit of their own research first, right? And have kind of their own understanding a little bit about what is human trafficking. So we often want to, if we're going to initiate a conversation like this with, our children or with youth. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the 11 and up age group, and I'll talk a little bit more indirectly about how to speak with younger children about, different aspects of consent and not necessarily directly trafficking, but different issues. So when we're talking with youth about trafficking, we want to be able to create a safe space for them, not unlike Julia was mentioning. Um, you know, and this might be you're initiating this conversation with or without red flags. So you want to talk about this issue with your youth, whether or not you do have any concerns for them, because it's a topic that they should be aware of, especially those, youth 12 and up who, are moving either from middle school into high school. And it is important to have these conversations and for kids to be aware. So we want to create a safe space for talking to youth and having difficult conversations. So, finding a comfortable place for them in the home or somewhere outside the home that they're comfortable, providing any kind of fidget toys or things that usually help kids during hard conversations that might keep their hands busy or might deal with some of the uncomfortable feelings. As a parent or a caregiver or a concerned member of the community, you do want to do your own research and not be afraid to use aids like videos or like we showed earlier, or different kinds of information, graphics and different things that could be helpful. You want to reinforce to your child that or the youth that they're not in trouble. These are important conversations to have, even if this is not happening to you. So this is not, I think this is happening to you and that's why we're having this conversation. It's more of a just like, I want you to be in the know and I want to have these conversations, and you're trying to create open communication with your children. And you want to both educate your child, but also actively listen and provide space for dialogue and questions, not only information. So you want it to be a dialogue between the both of you. Take breaks if it seems like this is overwhelming, which is something I know Julie and I stress a lot throughout this presentation, is just take breaks. If it's too much, it's okay to come back to it and revisit. And don't pretend to be an expert. Just be curious and engage in conversation around those risks and red flags, and you know, just kind of creating awareness for the youth that these things can happen. And you want to include a lot of online safety information. So this is a huge piece of talking about human trafficking with children and youth, is really doing education on online safety, which we can provide lots of resources at the end for that as well. But really driving home that safety online and interacting with people that they don't know. And don't make it a one-stop shop kind of conversation. You want to continue the open communication about the topic and the risks, and encourage youth to be critical and reflect and come to you if, you know, something happens and they want to review or kind of talk about that together. So if we go to the next slide, not unlike what I just mentioned, you want to use kind of aids. There's great aids on Covenant House website, lots of different websites where they have great kind of infographics that can be really great to use with kids. Because I know for myself, I was a visual learner, so helpful to have those kinds of things involved in learning about things like human trafficking. You want to define what trafficking is for the youth, describe those warning signs, you know, teach the youth to trust their gut, not unlike Renelle Bruder said in her video. You want to explain what healthy relationships are, which Julia is going to go into a little bit more. You know, and even create safety plans together. Even if nothing's happening in the moment, who would your point person be? Who do you think you could talk to, even if it's not your parents? Like, who could you go to? And creating and helping them with language to ask for help. And encouraging youth that it's always their right to ask for help, and that they can always run a situation by a safe adult. Again, you want to encourage yourself as a safe adult as their caregiver, but you also want to make sure that that's not their only option in the instance that that's not comfortable for them. And of course, if there's any discomfort with the topic, that's pretty normal. And I would just label that for them and express that you're here to learn together. And you know, this is not the most comfortable thing to talk about, but you want to empower them to have the information and for you together to kind of move that forward. And just some basic questions you could ask as conversation starters once you've kind of talked a little bit about human trafficking might be, you know, how much personal information do you think is okay to share on your social media? You know, how do you set safe boundaries when someone messages you online that you don't know well? Do you know any girls at your school who ever you know, talk about getting paid to make videos or go on dates? Do any of the girls in your class have much older boyfriends? So these are kind of, you know, questions that you could ask to kind of get conversation going around more personal aspects of their lives. We can go to the next slide. So I'm not going to go through this entire slide because I know it's quite a bit of information, but I did want to touch on the importance of talking about sexual health, safety, and consent with younger children. So, you know, as early as 4 years old, up until, you know, as early as 4 years old. So it kind of comes down to these two categories, which is, you know, basic information that you can provide them, and then safety information that you can provide them. So I can also provide this graphic to everyone. It's from the National Traumatic Stress Network, but it does talk about, you know, as early as 4 years old, you know, using accurate names for body parts, you know, explaining to kids rules about personal boundaries, you know, giving answers to questions about the body and bodily functions rather than avoiding them. So really it comes down to having these conversations that might be a little bit less comfortable from an earlier age. And it's just important to know, like, parents do play a pivotal role in helping their children to develop healthy attitudes and behaviors towards sexuality. And although, you know, talking with your children about sex may feel completely outside of comfort zone for people, there are many resources available to help you begin those kinds of conversations and continue them throughout your child's life, because that in itself is a form of prevention. And, you know, it's difficult even doing the work that we do, you know, to hear. I've heard many times kids disclose and, you know, they say, well, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it was that was happening to me because I never learned about sex. So kind of those kinds of, you know, conversations are really important to start having with youth and young children with a developmentally and age appropriate way, which is why we provide this information. And I'm happy to provide this graphic that kind of goes through each of those ages and stages. But you just want to provide clear, positive messages about modesty, boundaries, privacy, that are crucial for children to move through different ages and stages of life. And the last thing that I think I'm going to touch on before I hand it over to Julia is just teaching age appropriate consent to youth as well. I know that sometimes perhaps in schools, certain schools go over some of this, but it's important as parents to have those conversations as well with youth that, consent, the three main messages are that consent should be clear, consent is not automatic, and that consent can change. And the biggest one for me here that I notice in my work just as a, conversationally, that the consent can change is the hardest one for youth to kind of grasp, in terms of, they could be in the middle of doing something, and if they say no in that moment, then that changes the consent. So really having those clear conversations with youth about what consent means, that it, they have to give, they need to give clear consent, for it to be consensual, and that it's not just automatic because you're in the midst of something that seems okay, and that an individual can change their mind at any point in time, even if they're in the middle of something that they don't want to be doing. So those are kind of my pieces around that, and I'm going to hand it back over to Julia to talk a little more about healthy relationships.
Awesome. Okay, so in terms of the modeling of healthy relationships, this is super, super important for young people, because healthy relationships and relationships in general really have an impact on not only how youth will engage in their future relationships with other individuals and friends, family members, romantic partners, but it also impacts the way that their brain develops, their different emotional regulation abilities, and their overall general mental health and emotional capabilities. So if there's somebody who maybe experiences or witnesses negative relationships in their childhood, the behaviors that they see really act as this model for their the expectations of what future relationships could consist of. And that normalizes negative and toxic relational experiences in the future. And then as they grow up, they have a more difficult time recognizing when a relationship is unhealthy, such as when there is guilt tripping or blaming or shaming, or when different forms of violence come into play. They have a harder time recognizing those red flags because they don't go off that quickly in their mind, because they've been normalized to those different behaviors. However, even if there has been a youth who's been exposed to a negative relationship in the past, the cool thing about the brain is that it has this really awesome capacity to renew itself and rewire itself and restructure itself based off of new experiences, especially for youth. So even if youth has experienced a negative relationship, if it's followed by strong, healthy relationships that make the youth feel really special, loved, and cared for, makes them feel really safe, then youth can start to integrate these new experiences into their future interactions. And even if there is a youth who hasn't experienced, any negative relationship at all, modeling healthy relationships is super, super important. And so when we talk about healthy relationships for young people, most of the time the conversation is around healthy romantic relationships. So we want to focus on the romantic piece. But in my opinion, in my practice, there are so many different relationships that can model different factors for youth about how to engage not only with themselves, but with others. And those include friendship relationships, family relationships, romantic relationships, online relationships, self relationships, and spiritual relationships. And the way that individuals and adults and community members engage in these relationships open up different lines of communication for youth to gather these messages and all this subliminal messaging, and to implement them in their own life. So even when it comes to online relationships, the way that adults and community members interact with online is a really big telltale sign for how youth will then interact online. So if a adult really expresses the importance of online safety, and they're shutting off their geolocation and tagging, and they're showing youth how to do that, and they're setting limits and boundaries around phone use, that sets a really awesome precedent for a young person to have healthy online relationships with individuals. And then also in terms of romantic relationships, things that we would want to have in romantic relationships, friendship relationships, family relationships are mutual respect of a person's morals and boundaries, trust and respect in general. We want to have openness and honesty in our relationships, even when things are insecure. We want to problem solve together as a team unit. If we can show youth how to problem solve with two individual people in a relationship, that is great information for them to have and to take forward with them in other different relationships, because then they'll know how to handle an argument, what arguments should look like, the difference between abusive arguments versus healthy arguments, and how those pertain to the development of a relationship. We want to encourage you to ask for consent in relationships by modeling that as well. So asking another person before engaging in something and showing them how to do that. And again, doesn't have to specifically be romantic. It can be with regards to any of the relationships on the slide here. We want to show youth how they can compromise for equality while both partners are still being heard in a relationship, how they can emotionally regulate, and how to have an individual identity apart from a relationship. I think is super important to model for young people, because oftentimes when individuals think about relationships, or especially young people, sometimes there's this tendency to consistently be with that partner because you're so excited about them. You want to have the same interests as them. You want to have the same friends as them. You want to do the same things that you're doing. And then all these other things that the youth are interested start to fall off, like their extracurricular activities or different courses they're interested in or different friend groups they've been a part of. So we really want to uphold this idea that individuals, especially young people, can have a whole identity apart from that relationship, and that is healthy for a relationship, because then you bring back to the relationship different topics of conversation, more things to talk about, and all of that lovely stuff. And so we can also model this by having independent individual identities in our own relationships as well as adults and as community members. Another really helpful graphic is this slide here, and I use it with youth a whole bunch. I actually really love this slide. Most of them will always take a photo of it. And this goes to show how relationships exist on a spectrum. And so when we teach this slide to young people, we basically tell them that at any point, the relationship can be at any points on the spectrum from healthy to abusive. And we all want really healthy relationships. We want things like communication and respect and trust and honesty. But what we really want to pay attention to is when the relationship goes from healthy to unhealthy. We want to help youth to identify red flags before they even turn red. And I like to call those like the yellow flags in the middle, the unhealthy pieces. So we want to teach you that if you're engaging in an argument with someone, whether it's a partner or a friend, that arguments in relationships are normal, they are okay, but it's how that argument tends to happen and the resolve of that argument that is the most important. If this person you're arguing with starts to not communicate with you and not listen to you, starts to be disrespectful and not trusting, and all those things, and that can set the precedent for the relationship to become more abusive. But if the person is open and honest and wants to hear from you and apologizes, then that relationship can go back into that healthy way, and we want to keep it back in that green light. So this is a really awesome tool to use to help youth that we can also send out and share as well. And then last up is just identifying vulnerabilities and empowering youth around these different vulnerabilities. So this Venn diagram does a really great job of showcasing who's most at risk and which populations are disproportionately affected by trafficking. And this diagram can be used to teach youth about their vulnerabilities. When we teach youth about their vulnerabilities, this empowers them to recognize what those vulnerabilities are and how to have awareness around them, so that if there's a trafficker who's coming forward and trying to prey on or pick apart those vulnerabilities, then that individual feels empowered enough to be able to say no, to recognize that even though they might be vulnerable in X, Y, and Z different areas, that they recognize their self-worth enough to not succumb to this individual's behavior and toxic traits, etc. And so there are a number of different ways that we can empower youth. We can let youth know that their voice matters and provide them opportunities within the home, within the community, to share their voice and to have their voice be heard. We can teach youth about personal boundaries, and this one can be really tricky when I've talked to different parents and caregivers, because sometimes then the youth will exert that boundary and it can be really hard to then deal with that. But if we're teaching youth about the importance of personal boundaries, then we also want to respect those boundaries when they try to initiate them, because again, they're practicing those skills with us, and so we want to allow them to do that. We want to share appropriate vulnerabilities with youth as well. So we want to let youth know that we as adults, as parents, as caregivers are not perfect either, that we also have vulnerabilities and we also have conflicts. And we want to share that with them. We want to show them how we can process emotions, that it's okay to have emotions, and how we can handle those emotions in a healthy way and use healthy coping mechanisms and strategies that they'll pay attention to. And then that will encourage them to use that in their own life. We want to encourage youth to evaluate the safety of their own situation. So again, oftentimes parents and caregivers, we have all these fears around our young people. We don't want them to get in with the wrong crowd. We want them to do the right things, and we might predispose all of our fears onto those young people. But what we really want to do is encourage youth to trust their own gut, obviously within reason, giving them opportunities to look at a situation and ask them, do you feel that this is safe for you? Can you identify any red flags that might be unsafe? If something's unsafe, what would you do in this situation? So actually spelling it out for them and getting them to have that conversation around what safety looks like for them. We want to show youth that it is okay to ask for help by asking for help ourselves. If something is wrong, if something's going astray, if we're not feeling great, again, this teaches youth that they don't have to do everything alone and that they can speak up and talk to other people. And finally, we always want to remind youth that they're loved and that they're special, and that is the grounds for empowering young people. If young people feel special and self-worthy and self-righteous in their own right, then that's super awesome and will create a really empowered young person that traffickers won't look for and won't specifically target, because again, traffickers always look for individuals who have specific vulnerabilities. But if youth are empowered around those vulnerabilities, then they're completely off their radar. And so that's where I wrap up, and we touch on some resources and support options that Andrea put up here.
Yeah, so these are just some places to reach out if you do feel like, you either want to have a further conversation, you have some concerns, you need some guidance or some aid. So I put both Lotus Health and the Victim Services of Durham Region up here. I know personally from Lotus Health, we do take referrals from caregivers directly, so you can always give us a call and see if it's a fit for our clinic. I did put up the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, which you can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you have questions, if you need a resource, you can give this to youth. If they need help, they can also call this number. I put up, just so people are aware, the initiative of the care team at Children's Aid Society. So this is a new initiative in 2022, which launched in Toronto and Durham region, actually. So it's a specialized team of child protection workers and police officers who help to identify, locate, and engage children who are at risk of sex trafficking. So the hopes are to connect those who have been trafficked with supports they need and also hold offenders accountable. But it's, if you have any questions or concerns about a youth at risk, you can also reach out to the care team. Covenant House is another great resource for anti-human trafficking services, as well as they do have two shelter beds specifically aimed just for kids who are trying to exit trafficking situation. And they also have healthcare and counseling. We do a lot of transitioning our youth above the age of 18 to Covenant House from Sick Kids. And then I just put some additional online resources. So the Trap is actually a website where you can go, and it's an app where you can actually go and experience what it might be like to go through a trafficking scenario. Some different like Speak Out, Stop Sex Trafficking, Project iRise, and Heal Trafficking are all great organizations that you can also look at for resources. Amaze.org is actually great resources for talking to kids about healthy sexuality at different developmental stages, and they have a ton of great videos and different tools that parents can use. And then the National Traumatic Stress Network also has a ton of good information about all different kinds of topics. And I see One Child is another amazing resource. So I'm sure we could add a ton to this list. This was just not an exhaustive list, just something that, could get your kind of toolbox started.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, that wraps up our content for today. And we do have a post-presentation survey that I will make sure everyone has a link to before we open up to questions. So I'm going to put the link to our post-presentation survey in the chat. And if you click on the link, you can be taken automatically to that survey where you can fill out your answers. And it is completely anonymous and confidential. And so your name is not tied to or attached to anything, and you don't have to answer any question that you don't want to. You can feel free to skip it. And again, it's totally up to you if you want to do the survey at all, but we would definitely appreciate it as it better informs all of our services as well. If you do have a phone or device near you, then you can also pull up that survey on that device by opening your camera on that phone or device and hovering over this little QR code here, and then you can catch the survey that way. So I'll leave this up for a couple seconds and then we'll open up for some questions. And obviously, if you need the link again after we switch the slide, feel free to send me a direct message in the chat and we'll get that to you. We'll give everyone a chance just to be able to have the survey. Okay, so while people are just getting situated with the survey, that Andrea and I will open up to questions. And we just want to state before we do questions that if anybody has questions relevant to the entire audience, feel free to share them. If any more personal questions have come up for you, when we close out at 8:30, Andrea and I will be staying back and we can open private drop-in rooms. So if people want to talk very closely one-on-one with us, then we can definitely open a breakout room for you that will be private and you can ask all the questions and all the comments that you would like to. So we'll just make that known as well. All right, so we are now open for questions. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hands and then we can unmute you or you can send a question in the chat. We are here for the next little bit to chat about questions. And if you don't have any questions, you can just feel free to listen and then complete the survey while you're doing so. Hi, Stella.
Hi, Stella.
Hi, how are you?
Great, how are you?
Yeah, this is the first time I'm coming into a program like this, and I really appreciate it. I've jotted so much notes here that it's going to help me. Thank you very much. Thank you for this program. I want to ask, is it possible to have a copy of the recorded version?
I think we're going to record this, and if people would like the recording, I believe that would be okay. Yeah, we can probably send it out.
Okay, I'll be glad to have it. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you for being here.
Mm-hmm.
And Andrea and I also have the slides too that we'll get to everybody so they can have the info. Andrea, is that cool?
Yep.
Perfect.
Ina asked a question in the
chat. Oh,
chat.
awesome. Okay, to Julia, explain what you mean by a healthy check-in. Okay, so a health check-in that I was talking about is like after engaging in a conversation about human trafficking with a young person, we want to make sure that we're following up and doing a check-in to make sure that that person's mental health and state is okay. Because again, these conversations can get rocky, they can definitely get really difficult. So we want to make sure that even if they're not checking in with us afterwards, that we're having a support person that they can go to and they can check in with around their mental health and their safety. And I'll ask Andrea if there's anything that she wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It's just, I think, you know, it's a hard conversation to have. So we just want to make sure that, you know, we're checking in, and it's important for the adults to check in with someone too, right? And make sure that, you know, it's tough to have these conversations with your children. And I think it's important for you as adults to check in as well with someone who you trust and who's close to you, who can kind of, you know, who you can debrief with, right? Debriefs are always important.
For sure. And not even for the young person, as well as the adult or the support person who's engaging in that conversation. Super healthy to check in with your own mental health. Because again, it can be can be very tiresome. It can be very stressful. So making sure that we're checking in as well with ourselves and with our support systems and people when we're engaging in those conversations, for sure.
Yeah.
Andrea, we do have a couple of questions here. How do we keep kids
Oh,
safe
okay.
online?
A big question.
Yeah.
I think there's lots of preventative things that you can do to keep kids safe online. I mean, we want to make sure that, as much and as many privacy settings are available. We want to make sure, to some extent, it's a little bit harder when you get into working with youth, because, there is privacy and confidentiality that they want, but some sort of monitoring, especially for the younger age group, of who they're talking to online. And there's tons of different safety features now where you can actually filter out people not talking to them, who aren't allowed, who aren't registered in their chat. I think just really a lot of the pieces that we've talked about educating youth about red flags go to that online safety piece as well. So these things are happening more and more, within the online world. Unfortunately, the online and technology world has created even easier access for traffickers and exploiters. So just really making sure that you're having those conversations, but also making sure that all the safety features that you can have on your kids' devices are activated, and continuing to kind of monitor in some way, shape, or form until they're a bit older. I don't know, Julia, if you want to add to that. I also have tons of resources that I can send out, as well, that would be helpful on the topic. Like, I could do a whole hour on online safety, so I can definitely send out some resources around that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I think maybe when we get the presentation slides and send it to everyone, we can maybe populate some of those online safety resources, because there was also another comment in the chat that said, I agree. I think we need more training, understanding for parents on what to look out for, how to do privacy settings, for example, and what as parents we need to be made aware of. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. I agree. And that is some of the work, that preventative work that we do with parents, is we kind of sit down and do some of that online safety with them and with youth, as part of our program as well. So it's definitely important that parents know how to do these things, right? It's, I was saying earlier to Julia, I should be technically savvy, but I'm not that technically savvy. So I don't put that on other parents either, to be expected to know all the ins and outs of their kids' apps and all of these things. So it is important to have the resources where we can.
There was a question posed. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but
Yeah.
there was a question posed that what if, when I have these conversations, I am met with resistance? What do I do? My child doesn't believe this could happen to them or impact them.
Absolutely. I can start, Andrea, and then pass it over
Sure.
to you. Just
Sure.
a quick note, one more note about the online safety before I jump into that question, is that YouTube is phenomenal. You can go onto YouTube and people post themselves playing a game, what the game looks like, the chat features of a game. And so if there's like a new game that your youth is like super into, and maybe you don't see a presentation or a webinar about how to set up safety features for it, definitely pop that game into YouTube and see what populates. Even just watching another person play the game and the ins and outs of the game can teach you a lot about how the game functions work and how to go into the different controls. So I definitely recommend that all the time to different parents, especially parents of younger kids who are online gaming. It's super, super helpful.
I also
So
I also just popped a tip sheet that I use very frequently with caregivers, into the chat for you to see as well. It's called Staying Safe While Staying Connected. There is a teenager version as well that youth can look at. So I just popped that in the chat.
Amazing. Awesome. We'll get back up to the other question. So what if, when I have these conversations, I am met with resistance? What do I do if my child doesn't believe this could happen to them or impact them? I think one of the first things with regards to these conversations, if you're being met with resistance, the way that we have seen different people approach it in a way that was successful, is saying, okay, well, even if you don't think this might happen to you or could impact you, it's still helpful stuff to learn about and have conversations about, because you might be able to save somebody else's life. Maybe it's a friend's life that you really care about, or maybe it's a sibling, or maybe somebody in the community who you can recognize the red flags and warning signs. So getting them interested in the education, even though they can't personally relate to that information. Because again, this topic is very heavy. It tends to be very scary. So sometimes you don't want to think about the fact that this could happen to them, even though we know that embedding them with education is the most effective prevention tool that we currently have. But with regards to that, framing it in a different approach of saying like, okay, well, what if this was happening to a friend? If you knew this education, you could help this friend out. Maybe that would start to interest them and spark interest a little bit more. I'll pass it to Andrea to see if she has any tips about this.
Yeah. Well, I think you answered that question beautifully. And I agree. It's just about getting buy-in for the education piece and saying, okay, like, I mean, I'm glad that you feel that way, but it's also good to just know about these things that are happening in our community, in our society, and to be aware. And like Julia said, I think that piece around like, this could happen to a friend or a friend of a friend. And if you were to hear about it, you would have the education to help other people. Yeah, I think that's a great approach.
Awesome. There was another one as well. If I recognize red flags in my child's relationships, how do I approach it without them getting defensive? Andrea, maybe I'll pass it to you first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you're recognizing red flags, I mean, my hope would be that you've started to have some of these conversations about healthy sexuality and boundaries and different things before you notice red flags in their relationships. And that gives you that open door to say, you know, I think we need to just have one of our chats, like, how are things going in the relationship, and really try to talk through what are the aspects of the relationship that you feel might be red flags. I think using specific, like, language that doesn't feel threatening, that doesn't feel like you're judging their relationship, or doesn't feel, you know, that you're imposing how your thoughts and your feelings onto their relationship would be. So I think really trying to just create an open dialogue versus, you know, attacking the red flags right off the bat, just starting it off a little bit more general and check-in in relationships, and then move forward with that. I think it's hard. I'm not saying this is like an easy thing to do at all, because I know, you know, an instinct is to jump in and say, this is not good, this is not good for you, it's not healthy. But I think trying to have those conversations in a way that's more of a dialogue will be really helpful. I don't know, Julia, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, before I add to it, I did want to pass it over so that we can officially close at 8:30, because I knew we wanted to do that.
Okay.
And then we are happy to keep chatting and keep doing questions. So stay on, stay here. We'll just officially close out for those who need to leave.
Great, great. And with that, it is my pleasure and honor, my name is Eva Carpati, to thank you, Julia and Andrea, for an absolutely phenomenal presentation. I'm really struck by the fact that the reality of human trafficking is so evident by the fact that we unfortunately have to have you as professionals in these organizations. And I truly hope that that many people take advantage of your really powerful and, again, comprehensive presentation, because if more of us at an even younger age, as you said, 4, that's phenomenal, that if we start then to educate our children about healthy relationships, then it just proves your whole presentation how important prevention is. And that's what really you presented to us today. So grateful for that, that's the key. So that hopefully, I'm sorry to say this, Julia and Andrea, I hope you don't have a job. I hope that enough people can participate in your presentations that that you find work in other areas. But with that, again, thank you so much. This presentation, as Stella was saying, is so full. There's so much information here that again, we're just honored and really privileged to have had you. The conversation doesn't end here, it continues. And if, as you said, if people do have some questions as we say goodbye, thank you so much for staying on to answer a few of those. So on behalf of
I'm
National
just going
Council and Human Trafficking Committee, I thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Eva. You actually said what I was going to say. I just wanted to thank everybody for attending and participating. This has been an incredibly informative evening, and we will stay on for further questions. So Julia and Andrea, take it away.
And thank you for having us. We
Oh, you're
appreciate
very
it.
welcome.
We're always happy to spread information and spread awareness. And I agree with you, Eva. Sometimes I think about that. I'm like, it would be nice if I didn't have to have this job, like have to have a job. I mean, I hope to have a job, but maybe not this one. Yeah. Yeah.
Just playing.
Yep. Just something nice and regular and no people being harmed would be great. Yeah, so we were on the question.
There was one question here that that hasn't been answered.
Sure.
Is any of this education taught to kids in school?
Yeah, so that's
Yes.
typically what I do in my role. And I know there are other facilitators and educators, but what I've previously done is I go into all the schools. I work at Victim Services in Durham Region. So we do all the schools in Durham Region as young as I think the grade is grade 7. Now we're able to do grade 6s, grade 7s and 8s. And so we go in as young as grade 7 and we do a prevention awareness presentation that not only teaches them about human trafficking, but talks about healthy relationships, red flags, consent, sexting, pornography, all the things and ways to keep themselves safe. And so if that's a presentation that maybe you have, people in the community that might be interested in, feel free to shoot over an email and I can definitely look to set something up for a school, for a classroom. We even do sometimes parents or caregivers will request small presentations for just like a group of friends and we can do that too. So feel free to reach out.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I'm Bonnie. I'm actually Ina's daughter.
Hi.
Hi, Mom. I'm a health teacher. I teach primary kids, like K to 3, and I know that we talk about consent and like good touching and weird touching and things that make you feel uncomfortable. And we also spend a lot of time talking about healthy relationships and how to problem solve. And I mean, it's on the curriculum and I make sure that I do that. So anyway, just as a little aside. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
And I
that's
work for
great.
the TDSB.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And I think that Victim Services of Toronto and other I see they're asking about other regions. There is Victim Services of Toronto and I believe York Region, and I think they do similar prevention work. Yeah.
Yeah, and if one area doesn't offer something that the other area does, then we can definitely come in and do a piece. I know that we have a specific human trafficking department in our victim services, and we offer different services and supports that some might not, but definitely we work very, very closely with the other victim services in the region to provide a more collaborative sort of support system. Tends to be very successful. There's lots of uptake of the youth presentations, and I actually did 2 this morning and they had all the questions in the world, so it goes really, really well. They want to learn, they want to know about these conversations, right, Andrea?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cheryl's here from One Child. Thanks so much, Cheryl, for being here. We appreciate you. So nice to have you here. And so Cheryl at One Child also provides youth-led presentations in York Region and has partnered with school boards. So definitely take down One Child as a resource as well. Such amazing work. They partnered with us on our youth symposium, and it was so super successful in the amount of information, how empowered youth felt after hearing Cheryl speak. They're really awesome. Thanks for being here.
Can I just share one tool that we created from our committee? It's called a contract of mutual trust. And so it is signed by both the parent or a trusted guardian and the child. The child promising to approach the parent if they feel that they are in any danger, and the parent promising to be there without judgment and without question at any time of the day or night if the child requests it. And we got some positive feedback on that. And before anything even happens, it creates a sense of trust between the parent and the child.
I think that's awesome. In my opinion, I actually think that's a great conversation starter, because before a youth even sometimes the approach to a conversation can be really hard, but if the youth just pulls out that assigned agreement and brings it over to parent or caregiver, then they know, okay, now we're opening the space for a trusted conversation. I'm going to listen, and they don't have to figure out how to start the conversation. They can just bring that agreement, pull it up from a binder that's maybe somewhere up on their shelf, bring it to parents, and start to chat. I think that's such a good idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great.
Great.
All right, well, it looks like we are done. And I think we can sign off now. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for
Okay.
having us.
Thank you
Thank you
both.
for being here and bringing your expertise. And so, and Mark, thank you for your work. And we'll sign off. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everybody. And thank
Have a
you
great
so
night.
much for attending.
Night.
Thank you again.